Hey guys, it's Brooklyn Lou the Skeptic. Thank you for tuning into my channel. Today I have a very special guest. I really appreciate him coming on. I've talked to him on his channel. He's a real gentleman and I totally love the dialogue. His name is Ryan Pauly. He's a professor at Biola University, focusing on theology and apologetics. So it goes right into my wheelhouse. He's the founder of an organization that I'm sure he could tell you about called Think Well. He holds a BA in theology and a master's degree in apologetics. He's working on his doctorate degree. So he's very educated, way more educated than I am. And that's why I really appreciate him coming on. So let me bring him in. This is Ryan Pauly.
Lou, thank you for having me. It is so good to join you. You've called into my show many, many times, and I always love the conversation. So when you asked me to come here, I thought, hey, I have to say yes. This is going to be great. So thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. All right. What is Think Well? I wanted maybe you can say what that is.
Yeah, so Think Well is the organization I started that kind of is the umbrella for all of the content creation that I do. So that includes my YouTube show, which is a podcast and radio show. It includes all my public speaking. It includes all of my writing that I do. And I create resources for Christians to try to think well about the faith and about the culture so that they can engage the culture well. So it's kind of the umbrella organization that covers everything that I do as far as creating content to have hopefully more productive and thoughtful, engaging conversations between people who disagree.
Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. So
I love it.
Beautiful match. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to just chat about the existence of God. Obviously, everyone who follows me knows that I don't believe in the existence of God. And obviously you do. So this will be fun.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk first, and then I'm going to let you speak as long as you want to speak. All right. And then we can just chat, maybe ask some questions.
Sounds good.
I don't want to keep you too long, but let me get into it. All right. First off, I don't believe in the existence of God. And let me tell you why. Right. And there's a few reasons, but my personal biggest reason is kind of referred to as divine hiddenness. I don't see God. I don't detect God. So that's a real drag. Now, when we're talking about the existence of God, I want to make clear what I am talking about. Okay. Because you might be talking about something different. Right. When I'm talking about existence, I'm talking about something that has objective reality. Okay, now reality is the world or state of being as things actually exist. So we see a link between these two words, exist and reality. They kind of go hand in hand. Now, we're going to be talking about truth. So I want to define what I mean by truth. Truth, for me, is that which comports with reality. So we have that word again, reality, linked to truth. We might speak about objective truth, and that is facts that are independent of personal feelings and that are verified through observations, measurements, and empirical evidence. Now, what is evidence? Evidence, for me, is verifiable. It's gathered through direct observation. There's that word again. And it's measurable, and it's observed through experimentation. And empirical evidence, again, would be verifiable by direct observation. Now, I'm going to make a claim, and that is that God is completely untestable. So that's a claim I'm going to make, and you can hold me to it. All right. When I say testable, I mean capable of being tested, able to be subjected to examination or verification. Now, something untestable cannot be considered true in a scientific or logical way. And in philosophy, a statement or being that is untestable is considered indeterminate or speculative. It's certainly not considered true. So God is undetectable, and undetectable beings are indistinguishable from ones that may exist. There's no way to tell. You see, there is no scientific evidence that proves a God. None. There's no scientific evidence that proves the resurrection of the dead, or that that's even possible, let alone probable. It's very unlikely in my way of thinking. Now, supernatural claims cannot be considered historical. The only historical thing about the resurrection is that people have spoke about it and they've written about it. And I understand that. But when Muslims speak about Muhammad, they talk about him splitting the moon in half. And much is written about that. It's in the Quran as well. But that's not a historical event. Why not? Why don't we consider that historical? I don't, and I don't see why anybody would. It's a crazy type of supernatural thing that is unverifiable. Now, God, for me, is an abstract concept, and it's utterly and completely subjective. I feel that God is totally subjective. This is why we have different gods in the first place. Gods are concepts or ideas, feelings, and qualities that cannot directly be proven or measured in any way at all. Now, by the way, God is not an object. He's said to be spirit, but we never classify him as an object. And a thing is an object. So we can definitively say, truthfully, that God is not a thing. He is nothing, and nothing cannot exist. So that's why one of the biggest reasons I don't believe in God. Now, okay. Ryan, I give you the floor. You can speak about any reason you believe in God, and I'm not going to interrupt you.
Well, I'll keep it short, and then allow some questions or pushback or things like that. The way I often approach this question is I would say that I believe in God because he's the best explanation for why things are the way they are. So it's kind of like an abductive reasoning approach, is that we look at the world, see what exists, see the way things function, and I think that God is the best explanation for why those things are the way that they are. And so when I look at it from that perspective, I look at different competing hypotheses. Now, I don't know exactly, right? This conversation is more on just, does God exist or not, versus I don't know where you stand on everything, but I think like at least a strict, like a physicalism or a naturalistic, physicalist, atheist sort of person that says only the physical world exists, there is nothing outside of that, everything has a natural explanation, I think creates some serious issues and problems that I think don't match the way the world is. And so it's kind of this cumulative a case that I would take, where I think that, I would start with saying, I think there are really, really good persuasive arguments, at least that I've been persuaded by, for the existence of the soul, the fact that we have a soul, and arguments for substance dualism, that human beings are composed of both a body and soul. And if that is true, if those arguments go through, then that would at least show that a strict physicalism or a strict naturalism, that there's only physical natural stuff, to be false. Now, not all atheists are strict physicalists, but at least those that are physicalists, that at least form of atheism would have to be false if we can have good arguments for the existence of the soul. And so that's kind of where it starts, is opening up this door, I think, for at least the possibility of a being like God to exist, where if I have arguments for a human soul and spirit, then surely there could be a God who exists as spirit, not as purely physical stuff. Now, if that's true, then I think that also pushes back against some of your objections, specifically like an objection of saying there's no scientific evidence for the existence of God. Because to use science is the study of the natural world. And so it would make sense, if we only have natural things, that science should be the best way to understand and learn about those natural things, because science studies the natural things. However, if there are arguments for the existence, or if the arguments are good for the existence of the soul, then to try and use science to study something non-physical just simply would not work. And so by definition, in a Christian view at least, God is spirit, he is not physical, and therefore we should not expect to find scientific evidence for God, because science studies the physical and God is not physical according to a Christian view. So this would be like trying to use a metal detector to find plastic on a beach. It's just not going to work, because the tool that you are using has not been designed to study or find the thing that you are looking for. And so I would agree with you on that point, and saying, yeah, I don't think there's scientific evidence for God, because God is not a physical being. And the question is, if we have good arguments for some sort of dualism, then that doesn't create a problem, because there's reason for believing it. From there, I would then look at, I think there's a lot, there's the common arguments for God's existence. And so if there's a soul, if this idea like dualism exists, and the question is, okay, is there sort of a God? And this is where I would look at other aspects of the way the world is. I think one of the most persuasive arguments for me is the argument from consciousness. The fact that we are conscious thinking beings, I think, makes a lot more sense in a Christian view where God exists than in a lot of atheist views. Again, not every single atheist. But when you have people like Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris arguing that there is no such thing as free will, that your consciousness, Daniel Dennett argued that your consciousness is your brain playing tricks on you. It's like magic, but worse. I would say that's at least what some people have to do in order to, I think, reject or to try to solve this problem of consciousness, to say, man, this consciousness creates a problem for us within that atheist camp, and then so some then reject it. I think there's other ways that other atheists go about trying to solve that problem of consciousness, but I think that consciousness is a problem from a naturalistic perspective, from a physicalist perspective, that makes a lot of sense if there is a God. I look at then the common arguments of the cosmological argument at the beginning of the universe, and that's where I would say that while there's not scientific evidence for God, I think that we can have scientific evidence that support premises inside of philosophical arguments that do have theological implications. So we can look at the evidence of Big Bang cosmology, which is scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. That supports a premise within the argument that says our universe began to exist. And therefore, if that philosophical argument is good, if things that begin to exist have a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, then that would be a philosophical argument supported by scientific evidence that, if valid and sound, does have a theological implication. And so that's where I think science can be used to point towards God. Other arguments, like the design argument, I think is very persuasive to some. I wouldn't consider it myself to be, I think, one of the more powerful arguments. A lot of conversations that you, Lou, and I have had is on morality. And that's where I would say I am very, very convinced that there is such a thing as objective morality. There are objective moral values and duties. And I have found either one of two things. Either and I agree with the first premise of the moral argument that says if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And I think a lot of atheists agree with that and would say, yeah, you're right. There is no objective moral values and duties, and they would reject some sort of objective morality and support kind of this idea of moral relativism. Now, that's not all. I just finished reading a book by Sam Harris where Sam Harris does defend objective morality and grounds it on human flourishing. So I don't assume that every single atheist rejects it, but I think the attempts that are made to defend objective morality without God, I don't see as persuasive. And then any attempt that says there is no such thing as objective morality, I think goes against what is obvious to me in our culture. So I think the moral argument is a really good argument as well. So I would look at that. I look at the evidence for the resurrection. And I think that also points to God. I think there's the evidence from miracles, and that's where we have to be careful on how we define what a miracle is. But that's kind of how I would take this kind of cumulative case approach to saying, man, what do we see in the world? And so I would agree with you there. Like, we have to look at objective reality. The world is the way it is, and that does not change based on our beliefs. I completely agree with you there. My feelings, my thoughts, my beliefs that I have do not change the world. The goal that I have, and I know you do too, is to see the world as it really is, and then align our beliefs and our feelings and our thoughts to the reality, and actually have true thoughts that, as you said, that correspond and comport with reality. So I guess I kind of take that big approach where I see some problems with kind of a more atheistic, physicalistic, naturalistic perspective, where I think actually the Christian worldview, one that holds to the fact that God exists, does actually match with reality. I also would just say I agree with you on the idea of, I'm not claiming that God just exists in my mind or that I feel that he exists and therefore he does. My claim is that there's actually a being who exists in reality, whether we believe in him or not. And so that would be the claim that I defend as well.
All right. Is there one particular out of all those broad different arguments, is there one that's particularly persuasive to you? Like one that you say, wow, that's very strong, or one of the stronger ones?
Are you looking for something more specifically on the arguments for God, or even what I talked about at the beginning of like an argument for substance dualism?
Like for the existence of God. And what would be something that really, like you say, oh, this is really solid, you know? I think my top, so I think I find the argument from consciousness to be very persuasive. It's really hard to maybe explain and defend in a way that makes sense. So I think often the easiest to discuss, and I think are also very powerful, would either be the moral argument or the cosmological argument. All right, let's take your consciousness argument. All right, now I'm not familiar with an argument from consciousness, at least not termed that way. So can you briefly, really quickly explain what that argument is?
Yeah, so the idea would be that consciousness, and I can give you a definition here really quickly, but let's see, where would my definition of consciousness be? Consciousness is like what you are aware of when you're engaged in like a first-person introspection. So your awareness of your thoughts, your sensations, your beliefs, your acts of the will, these sort of things would come out of what I would say are states of the soul that you are sensing and experiencing. So you feel pain, or you hear sounds, or love, hate, these sort of things. So the idea would be that that consciousness, or our conscious experience, cannot adequately be explained by purely physical processes. That in a atheistic, physicalistic perspective, if I am just a physical body and brain, then we would expect ourselves to be completely deterministic, meaning there is no such thing as free will. I'm not actually freely acting. Sam Harris is a strong defender of this, where he says, look, like, you are merely a product of your brain, and your brain is not something that you designed or chose or thought about. It is a product of evolution for which you had no choice over. And so You think the things you think because your brain is thinking those things. You do what you do because your brain made you do it. Sam Harris uses neuroscience to point strongly to this idea that every thought you think you have is just a chemical reaction that precedes it in the brain. And so it would reduce emotions to chemicals. It would reduce your thoughts to just neuron firings. And it would turn consciousness into an illusion, as Daniel Dennett would argue as well. I think that we actually are conscious. It's what is allowing us to have this sort of conversation. I think without consciousness, and a consciousness grounded in a mind that is actually designed for truth, would make sense. It makes the most sense from God versus if we take that naturalistic evolutionary perspective. As John Lennox used to say, like if our brains come from an unguided, undesigned process of evolution, and from lower species, like why should we trust it? Why do I actually trust that my thoughts are telling me true things? Plantinga also has his evolutionary argument against naturalism, that if we are the product of evolution, that we know evolution selects based on survival and based on, fittest, not based on truth. And we know that there are false beliefs that actually can help us survive better. And so the truth is not an important factor when it comes to evolutionary survival. And so Plantinga would actually use that argument to say, if we are the product of evolution, then that should cause you to question whether naturalism is even true, because why do we trust our brain to give us true things? And so I think in a conscious perspective, the argument would say, hey, our ability, Lou, to even have this conversation, our ability to think about what each other is saying, our ability to try to persuade and be persuaded, I think is evidence that we are conscious. And I think the problem of consciousness is a difficult one for atheists to explain from a purely physical perspective.
All right, now consciousness, I'm not an expert on consciousness. I do think it's emerges out of a brain. So I'm going to go with that because that's how I think that makes sense. All right. I know there was a famous philosopher. I think it was Kant, but I'm not, great with the memory. But is he the one who said, I think, therefore I am? Something like that.
It wasn't Kant. It was... who said that? I don't remember now off the top of my head. Yeah, someone once said it.
Right? But I do think I exist, all right? And that would be one of the reasons, I think. I do believe that we are conscious. So we agree on that. I don't see the link between, let's say, consciousness, being conscious, to the existence of God. That's where I'm missing it.
So I think it would be that to understand what consciousness is, and I think our experience of consciousness, can that be properly grounded in a physicalist view of humans? So you mentioned that you would hold to consciousness being an emergent property of the brain, right?
That's that makes sense to me. Yeah.
Okay. So most people who I think, I haven't read every single thing on the topic. So I'll just say the people who I've read on the topic that hold to consciousness being an emergent property of the brain would more likely argue that therefore we have no free will if our conscious states are merely brain states that change and you have no control over your brain state. So if brain state A produces conscious state A, and then when your brain state changes, now brain state B produces conscious state B, and then brain state C produces conscious state C, you actually have no freedom. You are not the driving factor. There is no I that is forming those conscious states, and therefore your consciousness is not based on any sort of freedom, but it is a product of the brain in which you have no control over. And this would eliminate any sort of free will within that emergent property sort of framework. So would you hold the human beings free, or would you agree with a sense of like a determinism that we are not free?
I personally feel that we have free will. I'm not absolutely sure of that because I've heard arguments both ways and I could understand both positions. but I definitely live my life, and I think every human being does, as though we have free will. So that's as far as I can go on that.
Yeah. And I would agree with you. Absolutely. I would agree with you that we live our lives as if we have free will. We also punish people as if they had free will too. When we send people to jail, it's like, hey, you should not have chosen this. You did choose it. Therefore, you are guilty and you are responsible for your actions. And so I think this is how we operate. And I think it is the common sense way of looking at us. The question is, how would you fit the existence of free will with consciousness being an emergent property of the brain in which you have no control over?
Well, I don't think, let's say the thoughts that I have, I don't refer to that as consciousness. It may be a part of consciousness, but it's not consciousness in fullness. In other words, when I think, that's neurological. There's things going on electrically in my brain that, neurologists and people who study the neurosciences have seen and looked at. All right. And I see that as purely physical. All right. And I'm not sure whether that's my consciousness. Right. It's just, that's my thinking process. And it does seem to be a purely physical thing that's occurring.
Okay. So you would say that our thoughts are purely physical?
This is a very difficult question for me to answer, because I'm going to say I don't know, because physical in one way, yes, non-physical in another way. So I'm not definitive on either one of those. I think that our thoughts definitely are something that happens due to our brains. So that would be physical. But when we say thought, we're not talking about an object again. All right. A thought is not objectively real. So that's how I would answer that. So
what do you mean it's not? So if I have a thought right now of sitting on a beach, or I think about a memory that happened a year ago for me,
right.
What do you mean to say that thought I'm having is not objectively real?
You're having a thought, but a thought is not something that we can define empirically. It's simply a product of a physical process in our brain. It's kind of like saying love, right? I mean, what is love? You can't objectify love. You can't hold it in your hand, all right? It's not an object. So love is emotions, right? It's emotions. Now, are emotions real? I mean, not in a scientific way, they're not, but I'm not denying their importance. Emotions are important. But I think once we get off in this stuff where we're defining things in nebulous ways, anything is possible. Like I gave a definition of reality, and I think it's applicable here. It said the world or state of being as things actually exist. So does love exist in that way? I would say no, it doesn't exist in that way.
Yeah, and so that's where I think, and I often begin, and this goes back to the beginning, is I would say, do we live in a strictly physicalist perspective or physicalist understanding of the world where everything is physical, or do we allow for there to be a non-physical world? Is there room for the existence of the soul, a mind, feelings and emotions, to have a non-physical aspect of reality to which they still do absolutely exist? They just don't exist like physical things exist because they're non-physical. And so I think that's where my arguments often begin, because I think there are good reasons to believe that there are non-physical realities. I think there's good reason to believe that our thoughts are not identical to the brain, and therefore it would at least open up the door to new possibilities to say, yes, there is the reality, there is real world as things actually exist, and there's actually different things that exist. And that's where I would defend a substance dualism perspective, of that there are two substances. There's the physical and the non-physical, and they're both actually real metaphysical realities that do exist, have an ontological status, even though they are very, very different. So anyways, that's so I would agree with you that we want to look at reality. I would just expand our understanding of reality. Then it seems like what you would take as a strictly physicalist perspective.
Generally, I would call myself materialist or naturalist, but I'm not strict or bound by that. Okay, so I would, unless somebody can show me and demonstrate something that is supernatural, outside of the natural realm, I'm not going to go there unless it can be demonstrated to be true. Okay.
So would you? Okay. So let me ask you this. Would you accept like the law of identity, that if two things are strictly identical, then they should share an identity relationship? And if you can show that something is not identical, that if something is true of one thing that is not true of another, then what you've actually shown is that we have two different things. Would you accept that understanding of like a law of identity?
Yeah, it's like part of the laws of logic.
Okay, perfect.
Right? It's all part of it. And I have no problem with the laws of logic. But okay. I don't think the laws of logic are a thing. Again, all right. It's like we struggle with these words. Like when if I'm going to think of things, if I just go to spiritual using that word, all right, that means nothing to me. All right. It literally has no explanatory power. So logic is something that we use as a tool. And that's how I see that. I don't see logic as being objectively something. All right. It's a tool that human beings use. It was developed by human beings. And if there are no human beings, then there's no application of logic.
Okay. So what I was going with in this is a little bit different, is to say, if we could show that mental states are not identical to brain states using the law of identity, that there's something fundamentally different about mental states than there is brain states, would we not have to argue then that mental states are not identical to brain states, and therefore there's something different that we're talking about here?
I don't know what you would mean by mental state and brain state.
Thoughts versus brain, a thought versus neurons firing in your brain.
Okay, so neurons firing in your brain is physical, right? Right. So that we agree on. Now we're talking about thoughts and what they are. And I don't see them. You said they're physical.
No, I said thoughts are non-physical.
Oh, okay. I thought you said they were.
Okay. Sorry. I might have misspoken, but the point I'm trying to make is, if we can make an argument using the law of identity to show that our mental states, our thoughts, are not identical to brain states, then we would have to conclude that there's something fundamentally different about brain states and mental states, and that your mind is not just your brain.
Mind is not just your brain. Okay. My understanding of mind is mind are your thoughts. Mind is your thoughts. That's how I understand the word.
Right. So your thoughts would be in your mind. The question is your mind and your thoughts, in a physicalist or materialist perspective, your thoughts would just be brain states, that your neuron fires, and that is the thought, versus the question is a thought or your mind, or the thoughts in your mind, a different substance, a non-physical reality that exists but is not identical to the brain states?
I don't feel it. I don't see it. I don't experience that.
So for example,
and honestly,
yeah.
I never studied it that in depth. But
Okay.
in my real life, I mean, when I have thoughts and I use what I would call my mind, I am personally using my brain. There's not something separate from my brain in the way I see the world and see life.
Right. So I think that's where I'm trying to get at here, and maybe I'll just give a couple examples, and then you can respond. Is that if when we are thinking, then we're just using our brain, then that means our thoughts are the brain, and therefore the thoughts should share an identity relationship with the brain. However, there are multiple ways in which the mental states that we have, our thoughts, are not identical to the brain, I think showing that they're not physical. So for one, our thoughts are first person, private, subjective things. You only have access to your thinking, no one else does. Brain states are third person accessible. And so we can look at your brain, we can study it under fMRI, but we cannot know what you are thinking because the thought is something first person and private without asking you. We also know that thoughts are not measurable. Brains are. So you can measure a brain, you can weigh it, you can see how long it is, you can see what color it is. Your thought doesn't have weight, it doesn't have length. Thoughts are not measurable, brain states are measurable. We also know that, for example, thoughts have what philosophers call intentionality or aboutness. Your thought is always about something. It is you that has the thought, and your thought is about something else. So you think about the weather, you think about the sun, or you think about the conversation that we're having. Whereas physical things do not have aboutness. Physical things just are the way they are. They have what some call isness. And so those would be at least a few different ways to say, and also thoughts are very subjective in the sense that my thought cannot be false, in the sense that, so one example given for this is I can think that there's a robber at the house. So the fact that I thought there's a robber at the house is not false. I mean, you can't falsify that. It is true that I had that thought. The physical, actual reality of whether there's a robber at the house can be falsified. And so there's a subjective nature to thoughts, versus there's not a subjective nature to the physical reality. It is the way it is, independent of what we think about it. And so those would be just a couple for different ways in which mental states do not share an identity relationship with brain states or physical things. Therefore, I think showing that our mental states are not physical.
Okay, we agree, like we often do on certain things. All right, we agree that the brain is an objective thing. So the brain is. Thoughts are never objective. So there's a distinction I would make. All right. Yes, a brain is a physical thing. It is objective. It's something that we can test. We can observe it. We can examine it. All those words. All right, that are important to reality. All right, once we get into thoughts, all right, we're talking about something that is utterly subjective. What you think, by definition, is subjective.
But the question is, am I thinking?
A brain is capable of thinking. A brain could be shut off. You know, if you are under some sort of a big anesthesia, you're probably not thinking.
Well, but so there's definitely a connection here, and no one denies that there's a connection between mental states and brain states, or the soul and the brain. But the question is, a thought is subjective in the sense of what I mentioned, and I think you mentioned a different aspect of that. But the fact that I had a thought is not subjective. The fact that I'm thinking about a dog right now is objectively true. Mm-hmm. I am currently thinking about a dog. Now, the thoughts that I am having right now about a dog do not share an identity relationship with my brain. And therefore, the thought I have about the dog is not identical to my brain. And therefore, I have to be talking about a separate substance or a separate thing than my brain states if it does not share that identity relationship. And so the fact that we are all thinking, the fact that we have sensations, beliefs, acts of the will, is evidence that there is something about us that I think a purely material understanding of human beings rejects or cannot explain?
Well, yeah, there are unexplainable things, right? And
Okay.
I don't doubt that. I mean, God is unexplainable. So, I mean, there's no explanation of this. I mean,
what about God is unexplainable?
If you believe in unexplainable things, yeah, I mean.
So could you expand on what you mean by God is unexplainable?
God, to the best of my understanding and trying to look at it and use my own thoughts, my own brain to figure out what God is, the best I have come up with is God is an abstract concept. All right. It is something that is imagined or thought of from the human brain. All right. It's abstract. It is not real. It is not in existence. Okay. That's why I define those words, because if you believe that God is an abstract concept, then you and I agree, because I think God is an abstract concept.
So he's not an abstract concept. He's a being, an actual real being, a divine being who does exist in reality. So I would reject the idea that he's just an abstract concept. But I think, and I ask because I think we're talking about unexplainable maybe in different ways. Because, unexplainable typically means like unable to be explained or accounted for. And Christians can explain who God is, right? The God of the Bible has characteristics that we can say God is Trinity and God is love and God is just. He's merciful, kind, compassionate. So we can know God. While we can't know him fully and know everything about him, we can know true things about him. And so in that way, we can explain him. And some atheists explain away God. They say, well, here's what I see God to be. And you just explain that God is an abstract concept. And so that, in a sense, is explained. And so the Christian, I think, can at least explain who they believe God to be and can give, hopefully, an account for why they believe that this God actually does exist. When I say that consciousness is unexplained, is either often or these mental states and the soul and consciousness is often rejected or unexplained, it's meaning I don't see how a naturalistic, physicalistic account of reality can even account for consciousness. And the consciousness in the sense of giving us true thoughts to where we have an understanding, where we are processing, where we have acts of the will, where we have these mental states that are separate, connected yet separate from brain states, based on that law of identity that we talked about. I don't see how that can be accounted for in physicalism. And so while I am strongly convinced that we have mental thoughts and consciousness, because I'm first person aware of my mental states and consciousness, I look and say, what worldview, what can actually make sense of this, can account for this. And I think the Christian view of God's existence can account for it. If God is a divine mind who created us in his image with a mind, then that does make sense of at least our consciousness. From a physical perspective, I see it often rejected as an illusion, or you lack free will, or rejects the idea of actually having real thoughts, that thoughts are not real, they don't actually exist. And I think that would go against what I think is a basic understanding of reality. And so that's what I mean by unexplained. And I wouldn't accept that same definition when it comes to God, because I can give an explanation for who God is, and I can account for why I believe that there's a God, and therefore I think there is some explanation that can happen.
Okay, is God testable?
Yes.
Okay, give me a test that we could do for God.
Give you a test that we could do?
Yeah, if he's testable.
Well, there's different, so there's different ways. So the first way in which we test if humans are real to say, have they actually interacted with reality at all? Is there any evidence that they were ever here, or have ever been here, or are here currently? And so I think in the same way that we can do archaeology, and we can dig in the ground and we find artifacts that is evidence that someone was here because they left things behind that is evidence of their being there. Even if we don't know who they were or when they were or any of those sort of questions, if we find a pot in the ground, that is evidence that there was a human here at some point. And so I think that's why we can look at the world and say, okay, what would the world be like if there was no God? In the same sense, we say, what would this plot of dirt look like if there was no human here? And it's like, hey, we found some pots. There were humans here. And so I think that we can look at the world and say, what would it be like if there was no God? Well, if God doesn't exist, there would be no objective moral values and duties. And so that's a way that we can test God, is say, hey, did he leave some moral values and duties behind, so to speak, or did he create the world with that there? I think that we can look at the design and fine tuning of our universe and see that God left his fingerprint in nature when it comes to the information inside of DNA. When we look at the design and fine tuning of our universe, design requires a designer, and therefore, if our universe has been designed, then our universe has a designer. And so I think that God has left his fingerprints there as well. And so I think as well with consciousness, I think we look and say, okay, does something about humans evidence or show that there is a God involved? And I think that the argument from consciousness does exactly that. So I think those are ways that at least we can look to see, is our world different, or how would our world be different if there was no God? And I think that's one way in which God can be tested. We can also look at just the testing of the Christian nature of God and say, if I just had an atheist comment on my YouTube channel today, I think, arguing that the Christian understanding of God being Trinity is illogical, meaning it contradicts the laws of logic. And if something is illogical, like if the Trinity is illogical, you said it is. You would argue it is.
No, it's not logical.
It's not logical.
No.
Okay. So in that way, you can test the Christian view of God. If the Trinity is not logical, and if it's a logical contradiction like square circles or married bachelors, then we can test the Christian view of the Trinity, show that it's not logical, and therefore falsify it. We could also look at biblical examples and to show if the scripture teaches that there are three gods, not just one, then we have falsified the Christian understanding that God is one being who exists in three persons. And so I think that we can look at biblical ways of falsifying the Christian God. We can look at philosophical ways of falsifying the Christian God. And I think we can also then look at scientific evidence to say, is there any reason to believe that this God has actually made himself known in any sort of possible way? And so I would say for those three reasons, God is testable and therefore falsifiable.
Well, let me ask you this. You come across something, right? Because this is how I'm trying to understand this argument that design, right? The argument from design. All right. So we're walking somewhere and you and I see some fruit hanging from a tree. All right. We're looking at something. It's real. It's objectively real. All right. How do we go from that to jumping to now we have to say there was a designer of the tree? Now, I would say that nature itself is a designer. All right. If I plant a seed in my backyard and it grows, I could look at that and say, look at the great design that happened. But it was nature who designed it. All right. I'm not going to look at the tree and go, oh, there was a person who designed that. That wouldn't even come to my mind never would think such a thing.
Sure.
Oh, there's a person who made that tree.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's two thoughts that come to mind. Is number one is we actually have a pretty amazing. So I do this test with students when I go speak and I'm talking to students, and I'm speaking on a certain topic. I will often do this test with them where I show them pictures of random things, and I ask them the question: is this designed, or is this a natural cause? Does this come about by natural causes, or is it have an intelligent cause? And so I show them a rock, and they're like, that's natural. And then I show them an arrowhead, and they're like, that's intelligent. I show them lines in the sand that is caused by, if you look at like a picture of the desert, and there's a bunch of lines in the sand because the wind that just makes it. It's like, here's some lines in the sand, natural or intelligent. And they go, that's natural. And then I show some lines in the sand that says, will you marry me? And I say natural intelligent. That's intelligent. And we actually have a pretty good eye of understanding things that could be caused naturally and things that are the result of some sort of intelligence. And then what I go on to show them is the first thing that pops to mind as you ask this question is this is what some scientists would call specified complexity. And with specified complexity, we're actually looking for two different things. We're looking for something that is complex, but there's a lot of complex things that are not specified, which means that they're not end goal directed. So you can look at a series of numbers. If I just start smashing the keyboard right here, you're going to get a whole document of a bunch of letters. Now, if I made that my password to get into my email account or my bank account, no one would ever guess that password. It is extremely complex. But it's pure randomness. It's not specified in any sort of possible way. Now, specification or specified is then a pattern, right? So now if you have N-O-N-O-N-O, you now have a pattern, but that is also not very complex. And a monkey or a creature just happened to step on two keys on my keyboard could create that specific pattern, but we're not talking about anything complex. And so patterns can happen in nature that are not complex. And we go, yeah, natural explanation. Complex things can happen in nature that are not specified, and we go, there's a natural explanation. However, when we see those put together in specified complexity, our eye instantly can see that and have this design where we detect design. We're like, that has to be intelligent. So an example, instead of just a bunch of random letters and a bunch of N-O-N-O-N-O, is now a sentence that says, Lou and Ryan are having a conversation on the existence of God, period. That is now a complex arrangement of letters in a very specified way, communicating something important. If that sentence shows up, we know there had to be a mind that created that sort of sentence. And so that's the sort of thing that then intelligent design scientists would say, this is what we see in DNA. DNA being a complex language that is actually end goal directing the formation of everything that is around us, and is this incredible thing. What was his name? Francis Collins, who was on the team that encoded or mapped out the gene, wrote the book called The Language of God, where he referred to DNA being the language of God, of the language in which God uses and communicates and builds all things. And so I think we can look at that DNA level and see specified complexity there. The other question, the other aspect of this is I think, yeah, we look at a tree and we don't go, wow, designed, there must be that. But if nature can produce some things now. The question though that we're asking is what produced nature? So yes, nature, a tree can grow seeds, and then that seed can fall to the ground and grow a new tree. And we're not looking for any sort of human or God that was involved there. But where did the first tree come from? Where did nature come from to begin with? That is the deeper question on the origin of life issue that I think that we can also take that step back and say, where did it all begin? Where did the first design thing that came from? And then also, how do we look at specific things and see that specified complexity?
Now, would you then say that something that is designed, right, needs a designer? Is that something you would say?
The design requires a designer, yes.
Okay, now, when we look at something like a snowflake and we see intricacy, right? We see beauty, right? Especially when we focus in on it. And yet we would not say that snowflake was designed. If it appears to be designed, the design is purely natural. It's nature that designed that. All right. So with science, when we go into evolution through natural selection, we have a process that makes something, something happens, and there looks to be a design, but that design is purely natural. And that's what I feel. I don't feel the design I'm looking at. If I'm looking at, a beautiful person, I go, wow, that's a beautiful human being. I don't think, oh, that was designed. I think it's a product, that human being is a product of nature. So it's just how
Sure.
we're looking at things, right?
Sure. Well, so first of all, the snowflake would not be an example of specified complexity. That would be complex. A snowflake is very complex, but there is not and beautiful, but there's no specificity there to include a snowflake as an example of specified complexity. So there's so not everything that is complex or even beautiful is an example of specified complexity. So that's the first thought there. The second thought is yes, absolutely. Humans can create humans, and there's a natural process of procreation in which this takes place. The issue, though, is looking at that deeper fundamental level in two different ways, is the very building blocks of humanity in our DNA and the specified complexity involved in our DNA. The second is the origin of humanity to begin with, and the origin of advanced life to begin with, and then also the origin of consciousness. How are humans even conscious? And so there are aspects of humanity, like our consciousness, our origin, and our DNA, that I think are better explained by a God who designed us and created us than through naturalistic kind of evolutionary explanations. And so I think there's aspects, though, that we can look at in those ways and say, no, there does seem to be something missing, even though there is a natural process of procreation that produces the next species. Now, one last quick thought is I interviewed Cy Gart on my show, and I know he's controversial for some things, but he made a really interesting point where he is a Christian who holds to evolution. He believes that evolution is true. And at least on my channel, in that show, he argued that for evolution to even be possible, it requires a God, because evolution relies upon what he called the principle of inheritability, that is such a highly designed and fine-tuned process that there's no way it could come about by naturalistic explanations. Therefore, it must have a God that designed this principle of inheritability, versus which in a very simplistic explanation is to say, if through the process of procreation, my children that I had were 100% replica of me, then evolution would never take place, because it's 100% duplicate, and therefore you don't have variations that then are able to evolve and change and produce new species. And so evolution and speciation would never happen if you have that 100% replication. However, if you have a lower percentage of replication, I forget the number that he gave, then the species would die off. You actually have to have a very, very, very small error margin in how different the offspring is for it to allow for evolution to take place, and not for that species to simply just die off, which then he gave the argument in a much longer way that that the naturalistic explanations of the principle of inheritability fall short at explaining how that process even became possible in the first place. So that's at least how he would argue from a Christian, saying, yeah, even if evolution's true, you still have to explain the more grounding principles that guide evolution, and naturalism cannot do that.
Now, do you believe in intelligent design?
I would hold to an aspect of intelligent design, yes.
Okay, now I'm sure you're very well read, you're very well studied. I'm sure you know that intelligent design is not considered science, right?
There are people that don't consider it science, but I would reject those ideas.
Okay, but it did go to court in the Dover case.
Sure.
And at least one court of law said it is not science. So
would you
saying, and Ryan, I'm not saying that means everything. I'm just
okay, yeah, because I think my question to you would be, would you agree with everything the court says?
No, I'm just saying that it would be, one aspect of that argument is it was considered by a court, after looking at all of these different arguments, to be not science.
Sure.
Now, in the scientific community, which I'm not a scientist and neither are you, so I'm just saying, the consensus on evolution through natural selection is about 98%. Okay, so if you're going to argue that evolution through natural selection is bad science, all right, you're arguing against 98% of all scientists.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And you could do that. I mean, yeah. I'm just saying that this is not considered a consensus position of this intelligent design.
Absolutely. I think some of the greatest scientific discoveries happened when someone said the consensus is wrong. I'm going to go figure this out. I mean, and we have examples over and over and over throughout the history of science of when the consensus has been wrong. So I'm definitely, and this is always brought up by people, is like, well, you're against the consensus. Absolutely. I'm fully aware of that, and I'm fine with that. The question is not what does the consensus believe, and not even what do judges say. Like I'm really unpersuaded, unconcerned by what a lawyer and a judge has to say about science. I want to look at it itself. So if we want to ask the question, what is intelligent design a science, then I think we'd have to start with what is a definition of science. So I'm curious, how would you, Lou, define science?
Well, science is a methodology, right? The scientific method is what I'm looking at. And I would say, well, if it fits within this methodology, we can call it a science. All right. And, science can be wrong. That's the nature of science. I mean, obviously that's a big part of science. Science is looking every day to falsify things. So like we look every day, scientists are thinking of ways that they can falsify evolution through natural selection. But in all the years it's been around, it's never been falsified. Now, if it's falsified, I'm going to go with the falsification. But I just don't listen to a guy who went to a Christian college, let's say, and learned that, there's creationism or intelligent design. I'm not going to listen to I'll listen to his argument, but I'm not going to assume it's true when 98% of the scientific community say it's not true.
Sure.
I will listen to both sides and make my decision, which is what I've done. I believe that, humanity came into existence through evolution, through natural selection. And I am with 98% of scientists.
Sure. So let me ask you this. Would you say that the scientific method requires philosophical naturalism in order to do? Like, do we have to rule out the existence of God philosophically as naturalists before we can do science?
I think, and this is really a big thing, like the difference maybe between you and I, and it comes down to how we think. That's why I love these conversations. Because for me, science has to be based on the natural world.
So studies the natural world.
Yeah, it has to be based on the natural world.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's the question, right? Is what we say science is the study of what is true about the natural world through observation, experimentation, and testing theories against evidence.
Yeah.
Or would we say, science is the study of natural explanations. And therefore, we have philosophically ruled out any sort of supernatural or intelligent explanation before we ever even look at the evidence. And I think that's where often there's a disagreement when it comes to, is intelligent design scientific? Because if our methodologies philosophically exclude a category or exclude a philosophical category before we ever look at the evidence, then that seems to be very heavily guided by presuppositions. Because we do have scientific lanes that include intelligence, namely the forensic sciences. And so the forensic sciences is recognizing there are intelligent agents, and now we are going to do the forensic science, and we're going to study through observation, experimentation, testing, theories against evidence to point to who killed this person. And so there was an intelligent person here, and we do this at murder scenes all the time, where we walk into a murder scene or we walk into a dead body scene. And it's like, okay, maybe this person died by natural causes. Maybe they committed suicide. Maybe they were murdered. And we test the natural world. We test the real, physical, natural world, and do observation, experimentation, and then use the evidence that we obtain to rule out possible explanations. Where if you find a dead body with 10 bullet holes in their back, it's like, all right, they didn't commit suicide. You can't really do that. And they definitely didn't die by natural causes. This had to be a murder. And so it's the physical evidence that is obtained through experimentation and observation that actually points to an intelligent person, some sort of intelligence that came in that room, killed the person, and left. And so I think that's where I would push back strongly, because if the claim is made that intelligent design cannot be science, I think that is tipping a hand and showing the philosophical bias where we are saying, no, science is only the study of natural explanations, and therefore you can never insert intelligence or God. And that would be like saying, well, forensic science is only the study of natural explanations, therefore every single dead body scene is a natural dead body, and you can never posit murder, right? Versus if we want to say, no, I would take the definition of science saying, science is a study about what is true about the natural world. Mm-hmm. No, and therefore, that at least philosophically would allow for the possibility of intelligence to be a possible explanation if what we see is true about the natural world points to intelligence, just like if what we see at a crime scene points to intelligence.
Okay, what would be, because I think science, you're describing science accurately to me, all right? That is science, all right? Now, if we're not to use science to figure out how humanity came into being, what other process would we go through to figure that out? What non-natural thing can we look at? Because once we go non-natural, we're into the world of woo.
Not necessarily.
What is non-natural? What can we look at and say, oh, it's non-natural, but we can quantify. We can't quantify those things.
Well, there's different types of explanations about the real world, right? Lou, if you walk into my house and you see a pot of water boiling on the stove and you say, why is the water boiling? I can give you the naturalistic scientific explanation of the fire on the stove is heating up the pot and it's doing this to the molecules and they're bouncing off each other and blah, 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 and causing the water to boil. Or I can give you the personal explanation of I'm making some soup. And so me giving an agent explanation or the person explanation of why is the water boiling? Because I wanted soup. That's not anything woo, woo, woo. That is me giving a valid, reasonable explanation for why the water is boiling. Now, when you put both of those together, I think you have a more robust explanation for why the water is boiling. You can understand it scientifically, you can understand it personally, and you have a more robust understanding of how things are being made. And so I think that's what we can do when it comes to the creation of the world. I think I'm not a only Bible, never look at science person. I believe in what some call the two-book approach to nature. Where there's the book of scripture that God has written and revealed to us, and there's the book of nature that is God's creation, God's word, and God's world. And therefore, what we study scientifically, when we use science to study God's world, should line up with what we figure out theologically when we study God's word. And so we can say, okay, how did the world get here? We can scientifically explain that looking at Big Bang cosmology, and we can explain that in a person explanation where God says, I created to have a loving relationship with people. And so I think that we can have two different types of explanations that line up really well, that is not this either science or mythical or kind of this woo nature.
Well, if I'm going to, and I've done this myself, so I put it on me because that's all I speak for is myself. But when I wanted to actually dig in to, how the human species came into being and existing, because it does exist. All right, we
agree.
what I wanted to do is figure it out scientifically using evidence and then seeing where the evidence led. I don't understand how I would bring in anything unnatural into that. Like, well, I see this, I see that, and mountains of evidence suggesting this is how it happened. What would be an unnatural evidence or something that, would turn me away from that? Because I don't understand it. It's like, yes, I mean, I could go to philosophy, but philosophy doesn't even deal with this stuff. It doesn't even address how humanity came into being. doesn't even go there. So what other thing am I supposed to look at to determine how humanity came into being? What other thing am I supposed to look at?
Well, I think the explanation I gave before would be an agent explanation or person explanation. So if we have God in Scripture saying, here's how I created, then that's something to at least consider.
Yeah, but that would have to be objectively real. It goes back to existence. Okay.
Absolutely. I think what we're talking about is way down the road, right?
If you're suggesting that existence is not what I see existence as being, which I defined right away, I see existence as having objective reality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I see reality as something that actually exists.
Correct.
All right. Now, I was talking to a pastor just 2 days ago, and he's one of the few pastors who agrees with me that God does not exist. All right. Now, he believes in God. He just doesn't believe that these words, existence, reality, things, none of those words can be used to describe God. I think he's very honest, because how in the world can we sit there and say God exists but has no objective reality?
Right.
How can we do that?
So that would be presupposing your view of metaphysics. So that's where I would like to see what evidence you have for why you hold that physicalism is true and only physicalism. Because to make the claim that you did presupposes your understanding of metaphysics that physicalism is true and therefore anything non-physical doesn't actually exist. So could you provide evidence and argumentation for why physicalism is true and not dualism?
Well, again, I speak for myself. All right.
Right. I'm asking for your view. So for you yourself, why physicalism and not dualism?
My view is that for something to exist, it must be real. It has to be observed. It must be detectable. Okay. It cannot be a concept, because to me, a concept does not actually exist. We could use the word. So I'm not saying, we can casually use the word, but a concept or an idea, right? An idea is something in the sense that, it's a concept, it's a thought. An idea is a thought, but an idea isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. So for me, that's why I use definitions that I'm using. I mean, what would be a definition of existence that doesn't include reality?
So you're defining existence as only that which is physical, right?
Only that which can be demonstrated to be real, in the sense of objectively real, not a concept, not a thought. So I'm not putting a thought in that category. All right. That's why I don't believe in objective morality, because morality is not objective. It just isn't. It's like you're making a category error. You're taking something that is not objective and just saying, yes, it is. All right. And so, I don't do that.
Okay. So let me ask this. How would you define human identity? What grounds our identity?
What grounds our identity?
I mean, for example,
our physicality is a big part of it.
All right. So are we purely our physical bodies?
If we were invisible and undetectable, I don't know how we would identify somebody.
Okay. So, but are we purely our physical bodies? Is that what Ryan, I am just my physical body?
I tend to think, yes, you are a physical body, that you do have thoughts. Again, I mean, I'm not denying that you have thoughts. You can love, which is not physical. I mean, without sex, right? I mean, you could have love for another person and it not be physical. All right. So I'm not so strict like saying love is physical, all right? But love is a human emotion. It's not a thing.
So it's a real emotion that exists and is not physical.
No, it doesn't exist in the way that my microphone exists.
Well, yes, it's not a physical thing.
Or it doesn't exist in that way. Okay.
So is love an illusion?
If you want to say it's not an illusion,
okay.
I don't look at it like that. I don't think it's an illusion. I just think it's something that emerges out of our brain and is part of our thought process. That's how I see it. And it's the same. It is literally the same way a psychologist would see it. It's the same way a psychiatrist would see it. And now I could be wrong, Ryan. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Okay. But I'm sorry. I don't consider love a thing, an object. Okay. It's an emotion. All right.
Right. So yeah. So it sounds like when you're using the word thing, you're using it in a purely physical sense because you said it's not a thing like my microphone.
Yeah. A thing is physical. That's part of the definition of the word.
Right. So that's where I would say that's the definition of the word. And maybe I'm mistaken here on different definitions, but from a purely metaphysical from a purely physicalist understanding of metaphysics. Right. Because if our metaphysics, the principle of philosophy that studies concepts and knowing and substances and that kind of deeper beyond what is actually real, what actually exists in a purely physicalistic metaphysic, then yes, things are only physical. But if we actually can make arguments for dualism, that there are non-physical things and physical things, and that namely our soul is something that does absolutely exist and is not physical. If our metaphysic expands, then all of a sudden this objection, I think, does not go through. And I think one of the arguments for that is I look at multiple different arguments. We talked about one, kind of the argument of consciousness and looking at the identity relationship between the mind and the brain, and that the thoughts that I have are real. I'm actually thinking thoughts. I know I'm thinking thoughts, and I can show that based on the law of identity, my thoughts are not equal to my brain states, and therefore my thoughts have to be something different. But I think that we can also look at the fact of human identity and also human value. And so it is also not physical. So if me as my identity, if I am equal to that of my body, we know that physical things can be understood in two ways. Is number one, physical things are aggregates, meaning they are composed of parts. And physical things that are aggregates composed of parts do not maintain identity throughout change and part replacement. So the question is, when was I born? When did I come into existence? Well, I was born in 1988. Did the physical body that I have right now exist in 1988? No, it did not. So if I existed in 1988 and my body did not exist in 1988, then I cannot be my body. So what is it that grounds my identity and allows me to maintain identity throughout the part replacement and change? I cannot be something purely physical that is an aggregate like physical things. The other thing that we recognize is that our human identity is not a degreed property. All right, so degreed properties are things that can be divided and come in a matter of degrees. You can have louder and quieter. You can have harder or softer. You can also divide things. You can have a sandwich and then half a sandwich, right? You cut it in half. And the question is, can I have half of an identity? Can I be 75% of a person if my arms and legs get chopped off? Would you say no, that your identity and your value is a non-degree person, that even if I lose parts of my body, I'm still fully human?
I think you would be fully human if you lost parts of your body. Okay, because that's not what's defining humanity.
Good. Right? So what does that?
I would say what would define humanity would be consciousness. And once you lose your brain and you're no longer have a functioning brain, once that would occur at the point of death or brain dead, you could be brain dead. At that point, you no longer have an identity. All right. Now, people might remember you They might go, oh, that used to be Ryan. But you are no longer conscious. You're no longer functioning.
How do you know that?
How do I know that people don't function when they're dead?
No, if you grant that consciousness is not the brain and is separate from the body, how would you actually prove and argue for the fact that consciousness does not remain conscious, disconnected from the body? That at death, we are not conscious somewhere else, or we have near-death experiences that point to consciousness happening after people have an experience, brain dead, heart dead sort of experiences. And I would not agree with all of those stories that are out there. But the question is, if you make the claim that at the moment, because there definitely is a correlation between brain dead and our ability to think. And so if I die and I'm laying on the table, you're clearly saying, well, Ryan is not conscious right there in his body. He's not talking, he's not thinking, he is dead. I can see his body laying there. But how could you prove that I am not maintaining my consciousness in a disembodied state if we grant that consciousness and your soul is not the same as your body?
I would say that I could not prove that, but the burden of proof would be on the one saying that there is a consciousness that is disembodied. The burden of proof is clearly on that.
For sure.
I have no idea how I could go about proving that consciousness no longer is a thing after someone passes away. But I will say, right, everything I've observed people passing away. I've seen people pass away. Okay, I've never seen anything flying through the sky. I've never seen anything other than death.
I've seen airplanes before. They fly through the sky. I know what you mean.
Well, I'm saying I've never observed.
Well, if the soul is a non-physical thing, you shouldn't expect to see it flying through the sky.
Well, I'm saying whether something invisible and undetectable exists, the burden of proof would be on the person making that claim.
Right. So I've given you some reasons of how we can detect it. So one, you can detect your consciousness because you actually are conscious and you're experiencing your conscious right now as you're thinking about the statement that I just said. You can detect your consciousness as you think thoughts. So think of a childhood memory. A memory just popped in your head, you're experiencing consciousness. So you've detected it there as well. We can then do thought experiments where we see that the thoughts that we have are not the same as brain states. Therefore, mental states are something fundamentally different than brain states. We can also detect it by looking at the fact that our human identity remains the same throughout part replacement and change. Therefore, my consciousness is not my physical body. My grounding identity, my sense of self has to be grounded in something that is not physical if it maintains identity throughout physical changes. We also know that our conscious state and our self is not a degree property, meaning that we are fully human or not human, and that there's no degreeness in that, and therefore it's also not physical in that sense. So there's different studies that we can do and different thought experiments that we can arrive at to show that our conscious self is something fundamentally different than our physical body. And so that is something I think that can be detected in those ways by experiencing it and sensing it.
Well, I'd be open to looking at some studies or research on the subject, but I can only go by what I've seen in my own life. I've seen people die. All right. I've never seen anybody come back to life.
Sure.
I've never had them talk to me. I never had them come in my room and float around or whatever. All right. They have become completely undetectable other than their body, which goes back into the ground. And there is some element of energy there, right? Because energy can't be created or destroyed, but the consciousness is gone. All right. Now, is it possible it flew somewhere else or went somewhere else? Again, I don't see it, but if somebody wants to believe that, I mean, they're more than welcome to believe that. I don't.
Yeah. And that's where I just think there's a cumulative case that is made for this, where I would agree with you. I haven't seen it. I've seen people die and I buried their bodies in the ground, and that is where their physical body goes. And so I've not experienced those things that you have said, but I also recognize, and I think you would agree with me, that things can be true even if I don't personally experience them. And so that's where I would look at kind of a multiple steps to say, okay, is there even a reason to believe that there is a conscious self that is different or distinct from the body? And I've given some reasons to believe that. Then the question is, what happens with that conscious self afterwards? I think if we can make arguments for the existence of God, I think if the arguments that I mentioned at the beginning go through, then we can show that God is a conscious being who is not embodied. He doesn't, Jesus has a physical body. He took on a body at the incarnation, but God does not have a physical body. And so that would then show that it is possible for there to be a conscious being who is not currently in a physical body. I think we can look at scientifically. There's a ton of studies done on near-death experiences. And this is not just the book that are written of like, hey, I went to heaven, here's my story. But these are actually scientifically verified near-death experiences that I have provided, where the experience the person had provided testable details that were then tested and shown to be true. And so I think that there are good reasons to believe that the conscious self does separate from the body and have conscious experiences, and near-death experiences would point to those. And then lastly, we see this in scripture, where scripture talks clearly of there being a soul that separates from the body at death and enters paradise with Jesus at that, or is separated into separation from Jesus. And so I think that we have scripture pointing to this being true. I think we have scientific experiments of near-death experiences that point to being true. If the philosophical arguments for God are good, then that would point to that being possible. And the arguments I provided for the existence of consciousness and the mind being different from the body all would point to that possibility. So I think there's a lot of different steps that we can look at if we allow for knowledge to come through things other than only the scientific method.
Yeah, I mean, again, I talk to many people who believe in spirits, ghosts, demons, angels, gods, energies that are flowing. I mean, I talk to all kinds of people like that. I'm not trying to take their belief away, okay? Because people can believe whatever they want to believe. But as a skeptical person, all right, I don't believe things because someone said something. Okay?
Absolutely.
I don't believe that. So for me, I don't see the existence of any of these things. I don't think philosophy can ever prove the existence of a being, okay? Because it's impossible for philosophy to prove such a thing.
How
right?
so?
These things to prove the existence of a being, okay, that we need evidence. And evidence is not a philosophical argument. That's not evidence. All right. And yes, I tend to be more naturalistic, materialistic, but I maintain an open mind. But when people ask me to throw my mind on the floor and just say, oh, yeah, you know, this nebulous concept in philosophy, well, that proves the existence of God, I'm not persuaded.
Right. But so is what you just stated is a philosophical concept that is applied to how you approach evidence? And you believe that philosophical concept to be true?
Yeah, I tend to be. So, I mean, I'm saying that I tend to look for evidence that is based on observation, that is real, all right, that's empirical. That's how I determine what is true. That doesn't mean you could determine what's true by the Bible.
Right, but how did you determine that that's... Oh, sorry, go for it. No, but how did you determine that that is the way to determine what's true?
That's the best methodology that I've come up with personally.
Because of evidence or because of philosophy?
No, I'm not a philosopher. I mean, I know very little about philosophy.
But it's a philosophical concept.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I say I know very little about it, I don't mean I know nothing, because I hear philosophy all the time. And honestly, Ryan, when I talk to people about God, pretty much that's all I hear. I never hear, well, I have evidence that God spoke to me last night and I'm going to demonstrate it to you. I never hear that. All right. All I ever hear is philosophy. And I don't even think philosophy can ever prove the existence of a being. All right. It has to, if philosophy is going to prove the existence of a being, it's going to have to be backed up with evidence. It has to be real. And I live in the real world. I have imagination, I have creativity, but I choose to live my life in reality. And I don't see gods as being reality.
So what you're saying, and let me see if I get this, is that the only things that we should believe and the only things that are provable are that which is supported by scientific evidence.
And we might choose to believe in concepts.
Right, but that statement that I just gave is a self-refuting statement. Because the statement that we should only believe that which is supported by scientific evidence is itself not supported by scientific evidence. So if we're saying that it is true that we should only believe that which is supported by evidence, that statement itself is not supported by evidence, so it's a self-refuting statement. And so we have to at least conclude that there's at least one thing that we believe without evidence, and that's the belief that we should be able to show evidence for all the beliefs that we have. Well, and so I think this is my fundamental problem when it comes to views like scientism that says it's the hard science and it's only the scientific evidence that we can use in order to prove or know if something is true. But that belief itself is a philosophical idea that gives a foundation for science to even be possible.
Okay, well, you did hear, I'm sure you picked up on it, because I didn't say science is the only reason we should believe something. I didn't say that, Ryan. Right. I said that it's a very good reason, but there are other reasons which would be conceptual reasons. And those type of reasons, to me, don't move up to the highest level of proof. All right. Now, that's why I say God is subjective. You believe in the Muslim God, that's the God you believe in. All right. You believe in Vishnu, that's the God you believe in. All right. That I understand. You could believe for all different reasons. I'm speaking for myself. I don't believe things because it was written in the Bhagavad Gita. I don't believe things because it was written in the Bible. I choose to have a methodology to the things that I choose to believe that go beyond that. And I'm sure there are things I believe based on just concepts. Like I could easily say, like the Beatles say, I believe in love. Okay, but that's not the same as believing in something real. I mean, so I have creativity and I have an imagination, but I know the difference between what is imaginary and creative and emotional compared to things that actually exist.
Sure.
So that's my argument against the existence of God. God simply does not exist. That doesn't mean he doesn't have a role to play in your life. He obviously does. There's a role God is playing in your life. But I would suggest to you that that's just your own thoughts.
If he doesn't exist, then it would be my own thoughts.
And that's okay, by the way.
Sure.
I mean,
but I'm actually arguing that he exists in reality and it's not just my own thoughts. So I wouldn't support that understanding of God. Now, so when you say evidence then, so what do you mean? I misunderstood it when I said scientific evidence. So when you say something has to be supported by evidence, what do you mean by evidence?
Something that is verifiable, gathered through direct observation, and is measurable through experimentation. That's the type of evidence that I'm speaking about.
So that sounds like scientism.
It's not philosophical evidence because philosophy doesn't provide evidence.
Right. So that's when I said scientism, talking about the hard sciences alone provide what is true. You said you don't accept that. You didn't say just the hard sciences, but then I say what is evidence, what you just described as evidence would fit under the hard sciences. So that's at least why I made the assumption that I did. Yeah. And so the question, can we know something is true by philosophy alone? Let's go back to the arguments for God. Design things require a designer. The universe exhibits design, therefore the universe has a designer. If
that does not prove God.
If each of those premises is true, then it would conclude that our universe has been designed. Would it not?
No, every argument that I've heard. Now I know, this is going to blow your mind, I guess. All right. Every argument I've heard, like the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument. All right. These sorts of philosophical arguments do not prove the Christian God, never will. Okay. And they are philosophical arguments. They are not something that I could hold on to and say, wow, that was really persuasive, because every single one of them has been debunked thousands of times.
I know there are videos online that claim that. I don't think that they actually have. So what would you think? What would you think debunks the cosmological argument?
Okay, the cosmological argument is, and I'm going to say it as best I remember it, it's that everything that exists
begins to exist.
They added that. But everything that exists, it's like when we added for fun. All right? It's like trying to buttress the argument. But okay, everything that begins to exist has a cause. All right, and that cause is God. That's the basic argument.
Sure, I would defend the Kalam cosmological argument, which would say whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause.
Right. But when we analyze the premises, okay, this is the problem with these sorts of arguments, Ryan. All right, you're assuming and presupposing the premises are actually accurate. And when I look at what you just said, I could say without question, there's part of your argument there that I don't even think is true. All right. Okay. Like the universe having a beginning. I don't buy that.
Okay.
So why would the argument be persuasive to me?
Well, I may not be persuasive to you, but the question is, what reasons do you have for believing in an eternal universe?
I don't know if the universe is eternal. It certainly makes sense to me that it would be. All right. But when you get into arguing about whether the universe or a God is eternal, you're talking about speculation. And these philosophical arguments are speculation. And that's where I stand on it. I'm not gonna plant my stake on a mountain and say, I know that the universe is eternal. Okay, because I don't know. I think it makes sense to me. But Christians and Muslims and Hindus, they will plant their stake on the mountain and say, I know that there's an eternal God. And the fact is, you don't know. That's the truth.
Well, so it's not just speculation. I think that we have to be very careful because there's a reason why. So we can look at philosophical arguments against an eternal universe, namely arguments against the impossibility of actual infinites, the impossibility of infinite regressions. Like they're actually like pretty defended. Not everyone obviously would accept them, but pretty well defended and accepted philosophical arguments against actual infinites, which would then be an argument against the actual infinite universe. Then there's also scientific arguments against the infinite universe, which is why a lot of Big Bang cosmology is developed, believing that our universe is not past eternal, but had a beginning. And this is where you have Alexander Vilenkin and Stephen Hawking and even non-Christian scientists admitting the fact that our universe is not past eternal, that it did have a beginning at the Big Bang. And so it's not just speculation, but I would say that the beginning of a universe is supported by philosophical arguments against actual infinites, against infinite regression, and also by the most modern physics and astronomy and cosmology that we have today, pointing to Big Bang cosmology. So I think there's a lot of reasons on the side of believing that our universe is not past eternal. And so, for example, kind of like the category that you gave me before is if the vast majority of scientists would say our universe had a beginning at the Big Bang, and we have philosophical arguments and scientific reason to believe our universe had a beginning, then to claim it did not have a beginning, the burden of proof bears on that person to say, okay, what are your reasons for it not having a beginning? And unless you can provide a compelling argument for why our universe is past eternal and refute the philosophical arguments and scientific evidence for a beginning of the universe, then I think it is reasonable to land into the category that our universe is not past eternal, but had a finite beginning.
Okay. What is the consensus nowadays in cosmology? And do you believe in Big Bang cosmology?
I do.
Okay. So what is the consensus? Because I am not as educated as you, Ryan. I admit that. What is the consensus on, does the universe have a beginning or is it eternal?
So I don't know. I've been interviewed every single scientist. I think I recently did a show. I forget if this was mentioned, but I did a show where James Sinclair did talk about the consensus, and I forget exactly what his statement was. To me, I don't look at the consensus a whole lot because I want to look at the evidence. It doesn't matter what everyone believes or what most people believe. I want to look at the evidence. Now, if most people believe it, I think that's really interesting. But I would say this, I think, and I may be wrong here, but I think that the overwhelming view is that our universe did at least have a beginning 13.7 billion years ago, right? That is the overwhelming view of Big Bang cosmology, that 13.7 billion years ago, there was the initial expansion of our universe. Now, what exactly happened before initial expansion, that's where people are going to disagree. Whether we were formed out of a multiverse, whether there was an infinite quantum vacuum, whether there's quantum fluctuations, whether there is just different inflation theories or different cosmologies have presented different theories over the years that have been tested. And so at least I would say that maybe the consensus is that our universe did have a beginning. What happened before that, we don't know. But that does seem at least to be the understanding of Big Bang cosmology. Okay.
Can you respect someone like myself who says, I don't know?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a very valid place to be. Okay. But notice this. But notice this conversation started with you saying that you reject premise 2, that claims that the universe had a beginning. And now you're not saying that premise 2 is false. You're saying I don't know. Yeah, go for it.
I reject premises that are not proven to be true. So when I say I don't know, I mean it. All right. Now, I'm not sure. I don't study in that field. There could be some person who can make an argument that they know and they can put it out there. But I do not accept premises that I just don't know whether they're true or not.
Yeah, absolutely. But this conversation started with you saying that the cosmological argument has been refuted. And I asked, how is it refuted? So would you say the fact that you are not sure whether premise 2 is true or false, does that mean the argument itself has been refuted because you don't know?
Yeah, it's been refuted for me because that's enough refutation right there. But as far as you got to understand something, Ryan, and this is important to understand someone like myself. I actually think for myself. Okay.
Some would debate that. There's a lot of professors that would say no one thinks for themselves because every thought we have comes from someone else. For sure.
I learn things and I take in information, but I actually make up my own mind.
Do you think I think for myself?
I think you think for yourself, but I tell me if I'm wrong. I think you've concluded already that this Christian God exists. You've already made that conclusion.
Why could I not have thought for myself and come to that conclusion based on reasons?
I didn't say that. I'm being very clear. I said I do think you thought through it. All right. So that was thinking for yourself. But I think you've already concluded that. All right. So me, I'm always in a state of I don't know a lot of things.
Same.
Right? So I'm always seeking after truth. All right. I think that people who are Christians, they're not really seeking after truth anymore because they think they know it. Okay, so they think that your quest to seek after truth, I would think you're not seeking out after truth anymore. You think you know it.
So, yeah, okay. So let me ask a few quick questions. I think this is good. So first of all, I was pushing back against the concept of refute because I just Googled the definition really quickly. To refute means to prove to be wrong or false, to disprove. So I don't see how saying, I'm not sure if premise 2 is true or false, that's not a refutation because you have not proven it false. If your answer is, I don't know, you're agnostic. To say premise 2 has been refuted is to prove it false, which you're not claiming to actually prove it false. And that's where I think to say that the cosmological argument has been refuted because you don't believe it, I think we're talking about two different categories there.
Well, I want to say this. It's been refuted that one aspect of it, which was that premise that the universe began to exist, that's been refuted by many cosmologists, okay? And I'm not saying they're right. That's why I say I don't know, because I'm being intellectually honest. I do not know, all right? But it's definitely been refuted. And what I can say definitively is that that argument does not prove the Christian God in any way, shape, or form.
I wouldn't claim it does. I would agree with you there. Yeah, but it would show that there is a cause of our universe that exists or transcends our universe or exists before or outside of our universe. And so that's what the argument would show. Well, and again, if those cosmologists, if you're like, well, I don't know if those cosmologists are right, well, then they haven't refuted it either, because to refute means to prove true. And if they are prove false, and if they haven't proven false, then they haven't refuted it.
I don't think, I'm being honest, I don't think there's anybody in this world who knows exactly how the universe came into being. I don't buy that. I mean, I know there's ideas, there's concepts, there's theories, there's science, all this stuff, but it's inconclusive to me. And I feel I'm being honest about that. Right now, as far as the cause, okay, it's refuted, the concept, I can refute it right now. Everything that begins to exist needs a cause. God is the cause, so God would need a cause following that logic.
No, because it's everything that begins to exist has a cause. God did not begin to exist, and therefore he would not have a cause.
But you're just defining God your way. And
no,
that's not valid argument. Okay, to sit there and say, well, everything that begins to exist needs a cause. God, he always existed. He doesn't need a cause. That is special pleading and is fallacious.
So are you aware of like philosophical categories of contingent versus necessary things?
I've heard arguments that were referred to as arguments from contingency. I've heard that sort of thing. Again, I'm not a philosopher.
Yeah. So, and the reason I asked that is because it's not special pleading, defining God in a way. It's saying, look, there are actual things, and Christians aren't just making this up. Philosophy talks about the difference between necessary things and contingent things. And even atheists will use this sort of argument to saying, okay, yes, our universe has a cause there, but we cannot have, philosophy would show us, We cannot have an infinite regress of causes. We have to eventually get back to the thing that started everything. The first domino got knocked over by something that exists necessarily. Now, some atheists have said that's the multiverse that exists necessarily. Some atheists have said that's the quantum vacuum that exists necessarily. Everyone, I would argue, and maybe I'm overstating my case slightly, but everyone should recognize that whatever caused all caused things itself cannot be caused, or else you have the infinite regress, which is philosophically absurd. Therefore, whatever caused everything that was caused has to itself be uncaused. And so that is just showing the logic of the argument. And they say, okay, what is the uncaused cause of everything? Well, some will say quantum vacuum. Some will say multiverse. The Christians will say God. This is also, a way that scripture defines God as well. So it's not just a special pleading in that sense, but that's where we all agree. And now we're saying, what is the uncaused cause of everything? And so that's just simply to get away from this argument that if God caused the universe, itself has to be caused. Well, then I would point to the atheist who says there's this eternal quantum vacuum that caused our universe and says, well, if the quantum vacuum caused our universe, then that had to be caused. What caused the vacuum? And they say, well, the vacuum's been there forever. Well, so we're trying to say the same thing, recognizing that whatever caused everything, whatever caused all contingent things itself cannot be contingent. It must be necessary. All of us should be looking for what is that necessary thing that caused all contingent things. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make there.
Okay, this causeless cause, because that's the way I've heard it referred to, well, there's a causeless cause, like you just did.
Yeah,
right?
Uncaused cause, yeah.
Yeah. Did I say it right? Causeless?
You said causeless cause. I said uncaused cause.
Okay, uncaused cause. All right. To me, that's the epitome of philosophy. All right. It doesn't prove a darn thing. All right. It's just it's a head game. Well, there's a causeless or an uncaused cause. All right. That doesn't prove the existence of anything. That uncaused cause, in theory, could be anything. It could be a mouse. It could be a concept of some spirit in the sky. It could be Vishnu. It can be any of the gods. It could be my aunt who passed away and is now a god. I mean, it could be literally anything, because saying that there's an uncaused cause would lead nobody to believe that there's a Christian God, unless you want to believe there is a Christian God. There is no way that demonstrates a Christian God. And honestly, it's really a silly game. It's a mental game, the causeless cause.
I mean,
uncaused cause. It's like, I mean, the epitome of woo-woo. All right. I don't know if there's an uncaused cause. All right. You don't know if there's an uncaused cause. All right. And you certainly don't know that was Jesus. You certainly don't know that.
So I don't know. To me, it's just, I don't want to call you out, but it's very interesting for you to admit that you know very, very little about philosophy. And then when we have really, really strong philosophical arguments for something, for you to just amount that to woo-woo. And it's like, if it's like I say, I don't know anything about evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
But all of evolution is just woo-woo. You go, well, you should probably learn something about evolution before you dismiss it as woo-woo, because there's a lot of really high-level evolutionists that have actual reasons for believing this. And so for you to say, I don't know anything about philosophy, or I don't know much, but it's all this woo-woo, I go into some philosophical departments at Notre Dame or Stanford or USC, these major institutions and universities, and tell these philosophers that have really persuasive, reasoned arguments against actual infinites that what they believe is just a bunch of woo-woo. It's not going to go over well. That's just, I mean, that's just an interesting sort of claim to make. Let me ask you this.
I'm going to concede that.
Okay.
All right. Because I mean, I have no problem understanding that I may not know as much as some guy who's proposing this as, his theory. But what I do know, I do know something, and I do know that none of that has been proven to be absolutely true. All right. And I do know that there are opposing arguments within academia. That I know. And you know it too.
And I'm not claiming it's proven to be 100%. I don't think that we have to prove things 100% in order for us to claim knowledge or claim truth. There's always going to be opposing views. If an opposing view means that we can't ever settle anything, then no one would ever go to jail, because there's always going to be an opposing view. I don't think that having a different argument or opposing view means that we can't come to a conclusion about something and have high confidence that that thing is true. One question I did just want to ask you here really quickly is, you mentioned like a mouse could be the cause. Well, generally speaking, when people talk about the uncaused cause, they're talking about the cause of all the physical stuff in the universe. So if this uncaused cause created or caused everything physical to come into existence, by definition, it itself cannot be physical, and therefore it can't be your ant or the mouse or any of the objects that you accept
my ant is no longer physical, and the mouse is no longer physical. See, they are spirits. All right, they're not physical. They're outside of space and time.
Did that mouse exist prior to?
Prior to, but no longer.
So that a mouse existed before the beginning of the universe?
Yeah, there was a spirit, all right, and that spirit came into the body of a mouse, and then that spirit left the mouse and went back up into the heavenlies and is now outside of space and time.
Okay, so this is not your view. You're just saying what could be true.
I'm saying you could argue for anything.
So do mouses have the ability to cause universes to come into existence?
A mouse spirit may.
Okay, and a mouse spirit is timeless.
Could be, yeah.
Okay, so you're defining God and just calling it a mouse.
Yeah, and you're defining God and calling it Jesus Christ.
Well, that's for different reasons. But the question is there a being who is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, who exists and actually has causal abilities to create and power to create a universe? That's what this argument is pointing back to. Now, whatever you want to call that thing, who cares? But the question is there such a being that exists? There's a debate with William Lane Craig and someone else, I forget who it was, on the stage, where he goes, well, I think it was a supercomputer. And William Lane Craig's response was, well, computers exist inside of space. Well, not this computer. Well, computers have parts. Well, not this computer. And eventually it gets to the point where William Lane Craig goes, you're literally defining and describing God. You're just calling it a computer. And so whatever you want to call that thing is whatever. If you want to call it a mouse, you can call it a mouse. The question is, does the argument point back to an immaterial, timeless, spaceless, personal, powerful cause of our universe? And I think that when we look at all the descriptions and the implications of the argument, I think that it actually does. And if you want to concede, well, okay, well, then it could be a mouse. Okay, fine. Whatever you want to call that thing, it is evidence that there is something that transcends our universe that has the power to create that universe. Now, yes, I would give a whole bunch of other arguments to how I would argue that that is Jesus. But that's what the cosmological argument would do. And if it is valid, if there is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, transcendent, personal cause of our universe, then atheism would be false.
Okay, but we don't know that there is anything outside of space and time. That is, again, a claim. All right, that is an unproven claim. All right, so, for me just to say, well, there's something outside of space and time, again, could it be Allah that's outside of space and time?
If it is, atheism would be false.
I agree.
Yeah.
But I haven't had anybody demonstrate that there is anything outside of space and time. If I were to know that something is outside of space and time, that would get me one step closer to your belief system. All right. Not necessarily going to be Christian, but I'll say, well, now I know there's something outside of space and time. All right. But to me, something that is outside of space and time is indistinguishable from something that does not exist. We cannot test this. We do not know this. It is just speculation and claims. Once your scientific world and people come and they say, now we have proven that there's something outside of space and time, my next question would be, what is it? That would be my next
I guess I just wouldn't accept the claim that major academic respected institutions have entire departments of speculation, right? Because what you're saying is that philosophy is speculation, because here's a philosophical argument. So if all philosophy is speculation, then that means Oxford and Stanford and all these major institutions all over the world are hiring and creating departments and giving degrees and just pure speculation. I actually would argue that philosophy gives us knowledge, because knowledge doesn't only come from sciences and observation in that sense. So that's why I think there's just a fundamental disagree with us. And when it comes to our epistemology, right? Because again, that's another, we're saying that philosophy is all speculation because me and you have a different understanding of epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy. So we have to do philosophy to understand epistemology, which is a study of knowledge and how we know, in order to say this is not a valid branch of knowledge. But you have to use that branch of knowledge to do it, which is why, not saying you're scientistic, but why scientism is self-refuting, because you have to do philosophy to even get to that idea to begin with. And therefore, I don't accept the conclusion that philosophy is true speculation.
Okay. I mean, we disagree, as we knew coming in.
Yeah.
There's nothing a surprise for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think it's been a wonderful discussion.
I've had a blast. Blast.
Yeah, and I hope I challenged you a little bit, maybe stimulated the brain cells.
Yeah, and let me just say one thing to finish, because I want to agree with you that when we had the whole conversation of think for yourself, I want to say, like, look, I just finished reading one of Sam Harris's books because I don't want to come to the conclusion that Christianity is true and then stop thinking. And therefore, I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to think. That's why you know this. I don't know about your audience, right? Because Lou calls into my show. I have a show on YouTube every week. I invite callers because I want people to come in, not just so I can prove them wrong, but because I feel like I don't know everything. I know that I don't know everything, and I want to learn. I want to be challenged, and I want to think about these things. And my views have changed over the years. And so that's why I continue to read atheists. I read every book that's recommended to me by atheists. I read Christian books as well. And I want to challenge everyone to do the same and not just read within your group, but read people who actually think that you're wrong. Find the best, most intelligent, brightest minds who think you're wrong. Those are the people that you should seek out so that we don't just turn into siloed thinking. And so I think that I do that. And that's what I want to encourage others to do as well. So, Lou, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Ryan, let me say this. All right. Anyone who's watching this, go over. I'll put Ryan's link in the chat, not the chat, the description once I post this video. And please go over and subscribe to Ryan. He is one of the few Christian apologists that I speak with that I think is an honest actor. And that's always respectful, right? Because I would say, Ryan, that even in, let's say, the atheist community or the Christian community, there are dishonest actors, that are just trying to win an argument. I do think of your arguments. I give it a lot of thought, and it helps me, all right, because I'm not afraid of changing my mind.
Yeah.
All right. So I think this was a wonderful conversation. I think a lot of people could get a lot out of it, so
I think so too.
And appreciate you. Anyone who's watching this, like, subscribe, comment, continue the discussion below.
Do it.
And if you really like my channel, you can buy me a coffee.
There we go. Roast you some coffee.
All right. Thank you, Ryan.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thanks for the time. It was a pleasure.
All right. Bye.